The year was 1970, and the Houston Astrodome was a universe of light and sound, a galaxy of screaming fans all orbiting the sun at its center. That sun was Elvis Presley, a man in a white jumpsuit, a living legend whose voice could shake the foundations of the world. He moved like lightning, a blur of energy and charisma, and the roar of the 18,000 people packed into the stadium was a physical force, a tidal wave of adoration that crashed against the stage with every note he sang. He was at the absolute peak of his power, a king in his castle, and nothing in the world could stop him. And then he stopped. Right in the middle of a thunderous guitar solo, he held up a single hand. The band, seasoned professionals who could follow his every move in their sleep, faltered. The lead guitarist's fingers froze over the strings. The drummer's sticks hovered mid-air. The music died, not with a fade, but with a sudden, jarring halt. A wave of silence, heavy and unnatural, rolled through the Astrodome, extinguishing the roar of the crowd like a blanket thrown over a fire. 18,000 people, who just a second ago were lost in a frenzy of rock and roll, now stood in stunned confusion. On the stage, Elvis did not move. He simply stood, his eyes fixed on a point in the crowd, a single spot in the vast sea of faces. What nobody knew was that this was not a technical difficulty. This was not part of the show. The most famous entertainer in the world had just seen something that had reached past the spotlights and the fame, past the persona of the king, and touched the man inside. Down in the fifth row, a small commotion was brewing, a tiny whirlpool in the still ocean of the audience. A security guard, a large man with a stern face, was arguing with a woman. She was holding a small child in her arms, a boy who looked no older than 7, pale and fragile under the harsh stadium lights. The guard was pointing toward the exit, his voice low but firm. The woman was shaking her head, her eyes pleading. They were causing a disruption, breaking the unspoken rules of the concert, and they had to go. But can a man who commands the world's attention really be distracted by one small boy? And what was the shocking truth behind this child's desperate journey? A truth that connected him to the star's own hidden past. The world held its breath, waiting for the king to speak, completely unaware that what was about to happen would leave every single person in that stadium in tears. The great hall of the Astrodome shimmered with the energy of 1,000 suns, a place where dreams were made real for the price of a ticket. The air was thick with the scent of popcorn and electricity, the collective anticipation of a crowd about to witness a miracle. Ben Carter stood near the back of the arena, a notepad in his hand, and a familiar sense of weariness in his bones. He was a journalist for a major magazine, and he had been assigned to cover the tour, a story about the king's triumphant return to live performances. For Ben, it was just another job. He had seen it all, interviewed rock stars and movie legends, politicians and poets. He had grown cynical, believing that everything at this level was a performance, an act carefully crafted for public consumption. He had come expecting to see the show, not to feel it. He checked his watch. Half an hour in, and Elvis was in top form. The energy was undeniable. Just get a few good quotes about the spectacle, his editor had said. Talk about the screaming fans, the flashy jumpsuits, the legend himself. Easy stuff. He was jotting down a note about the almost religious fervor of the crowd when the music stopped. The sudden silence was more shocking than any explosion. It was a void where a universe of sound had just been. Ben's head snapped up. He saw Elvis, standing motionless, a statue in the glare of the spotlights. The crowd, a single beast with 18,000 heads, murmured in confusion. Ben's journalistic instincts kicked in, overriding his cynicism. This was not on the set list. He saw the spotlight swing wildly for a moment before settling on a section of the crowd not far from the stage. Ben started moving, pushing his way through the frozen audience, trying to get a better look. He saw the security guard, his face a mask of professional annoyance, trying to escort a woman and a child out of the aisle. The woman clutched the boy tightly, her face a portrait of desperation. The boy himself was small, his head resting on his mother's shoulder, his thin frame wrapped in a blanket despite the Texas heat. From the back, the promoter, a man whose entire career was built on shows running smoothly, was speaking frantically into his headset, his face turning a shade of purple. This was a disaster, a multi-thousand-dollar production ground to a halt because of a fan dispute. Then the king's voice, amplified to fill every corner of the vast dome, cut through the tension. "Hold on," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of absolute command. "Let them be. Let the boy and his mother come forward." The security guard froze, his hand halfway to the woman's arm. He looked from the woman to the stage, confusion warring with years of training. The crowd murmured again, a ripple of intrigue spreading through the seats. Phones and cameras, which had been lowered, were now raised again, their lenses trained on the unfolding drama. This was better than a concert. It was a mystery. Ben finally found a vantage point on a set of stairs, giving him a clear view of the stage and the aisle. He saw the guard step back, defeated by a single sentence from the man in charge. The woman, whose name was Sarah, looked up toward the stage, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She adjusted her son in her arms and began to walk forward, a slow, tentative journey into the spotlight. The crowd parted for her, as if by royal decree. Ben watched, his pen hovering over his notepad. He had already started writing the story in his head. A clever publicity stunt, perhaps, a way to show the king's softer side, a manufactured moment of compassion. It was a good story, but one he felt he had written 100 times before about 100 different celebrities. What he didn't know, what no one could know, was that this was not a story being written by a publicist. This was a story that had begun years ago in a small, dusty town in Mississippi, and was now reaching its unexpected and heartbreaking conclusion in the heart of Texas. He watched as the fragile mother and her sick child made their way to the foot of the stage, two small figures in the shadow of a giant. The king knelt down, bringing himself to their level, the sequined cape of his jumpsuit pooling around him on the stage. The entire Astrodome leaned in, a silent witness to a conversation they could not hear. Then Carter's cynicism began to fade, replaced by a feeling he hadn't experienced in years: genuine curiosity. He was no longer just a reporter covering a concert. He was part of an audience of 18,000, watching a king hold court with his smallest subject. And he had a sudden, powerful feeling that the world was about to change. For one small boy, it already. As Elvis watched the woman and her child approach the stage, the roar of the Astrodome faded into a distant hum. The thousands of screaming fans, the flashing lights, the immense pressure of the show, it all dissolved, leaving only this one, small, fragile scene. He saw the boy's pale face, the blanket wrapped around his thin shoulders, and the raw, desperate hope in the mother's eyes. And in that moment, he was no longer the king of rock and roll. He was just a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, the son of a woman named Gladys, who had loved him with that same fierce, all-consuming devotion. A wave of memory, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He remembered the small two-room house where he was born, the feeling of dirt between his bare toes, the constant struggle for every meal. He remembered his mother working her fingers to the bone, taking any job she could find to keep their small family afloat. She had been his first fan, his fiercest defender. When he was just a boy, too shy to sing in front of anyone, she had been the one to coax the music out of him, telling him his voice was a gift from God. He saw that same fire in Sarah's eyes, the look of a mother who would walk through fire for her child, who would challenge the entire world for one small moment of happiness for her son. But it was more than. It was the boy himself that struck a chord deep in Elvis's soul, a chord of profound and permanent sorrow. He looked at Leo's frail form and he saw a ghost, the ghost of the brother he never had. Jesse Garan Presley, his identical twin, had been stillborn just minutes before Elvis entered the world. He had grown up as an only child, but he had always felt the presence of that other half, the missing piece of his own soul. His mother had told him stories, how God had taken one of them home so the other could have all the strength. Throughout his life, Elvis had spoken to his lost brother, in his quiet moments, wondering what he would have been like, feeling a connection to a person he had never met. He saw the fragility of life embodied in the small boy before him. He saw the randomness of fate, how one brother lived to become a king, while the other never drew a breath. This moment, this interruption, it was no longer about a fan. It was a collision of past and present, a deeply personal moment playing out on the world's biggest stage. The security guard, the promoter, the jaded journalist, they saw a celebrity being kind to a sick fan. But Elvis felt something much deeper. He felt the universe was giving him a chance to offer a small measure of comfort, a chance to honor the memory of his mother's love and his brother's brief existence. This was not a choice, it was a duty. The connection was instantaneous and absolute. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to stop the show. He had to know this boy's name. He had to let him know he was seen. As Sarah and Leo reached the foot of the stage, the stadium was so quiet you could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning. The king of rock and roll knelt down, the lights catching the jewels on his famous jumpsuit, making them sparkle like a constellation. But his eyes were soft, his larger-than-life stage persona completely gone, replaced by a simple, gentle humanity. He was not looking at his audience of thousands. He was looking at his audience of one. The world watched as he leaned forward, speaking so softly that no one could hear the words, a private conversation in a public arena. 18,000 people held their breath, realizing they were witnessing something sacred, a moment of pure, unscripted grace. And in that moment, the gap between the legendary star on the stage and the people in the seats vanished completely. They were all just people, bound together by the fragility of life and the powerful, healing magic of a simple song. The story of this night in Houston did not begin with the flash of spotlights or the roar of a crowd. It began in the profound quiet of a small, sun-faded house in a town whose name you wouldn't know. It began in a room painted pale yellow, where the only sound for many weeks had been the soft beep of a medical monitor and the gentle whir of an air purifier. This was Leo's world, a 7-year-old boy whose universe had shrunk to the size of his bed. His illness was a complex, cruel thing, with a long clinical name that his mother, Sarah, could barely pronounce. To Leo, it was simply the tiads, a heavy, invisible blanket that kept him from running in the yard or climbing the old oak tree. It stole his breath and his strength, but it had not yet managed to conquer the vast and vibrant world that lived inside his imagination. In that world, Leo was not sick, he was strong and fast, and he had a best friend who was the coolest person on the planet. This friend wore sparkling white jumpsuits, had a voice that could make the windows rattle, and moved like a lightning storm set to music. This friend was Elvis Presley. Sarah didn't know how the fixation had started. Maybe it was an old record she had played one afternoon, a desperate attempt to fill the heavy silence. Maybe it was a movie she'd put on the small television in the corner of his room. Whatever the origin, Elvis's voice had become a kind of medicine that no doctor could prescribe. When the deep, rich sound of his singing filled the room, a change would come over Leo. The lines of pain on his small face would soften. His eyes, often dull with exhaustion, would regain a spark of their old light. He would tap his fingers on the worn quilt that covered him, a faint but determined rhythm, his small body responding to the life in the music. "He sounds like a superhero, Mama," Leo had whispered one evening, his voice thin and reedy, like he could beat up all the bad guys. Sarah had knelt by his bed, smoothing his hair. "He does, honey. He really does." The music became their ritual, their shield against the endless parade of doctors, nurses, and frightening medical terms. It was a shared language of hope, in a world that was becoming increasingly hopeless. The doctors were kind, but their faces were growing more serious with each visit. They spoke in hushed tones in the hallway, using words like options and quality of life. Sarah understood what they were not saying. They were preparing her for the end. But a mother's heart is a stubborn, illogical thing. It refuses to accept endings. It searches for miracles in the dark. One night, as the final notes of "Love Me Tender" faded from the small radio, Leo turned to her, his eyes shining in the dim light. "I wish I could see him for real," he said, the words barely a breath. "Just for 1 minute. I would tell him thank you for the songs." That whisper, so full of innocent longing, pierced Sarah's heart. It was not a childish whim, it was a dying wish. In that moment, a fierce, unshakable resolve took root in her soul. The doctors could have their charts and their probabilities. She would chase a miracle. The next morning she saw a newspaper ad. Elvis Presley. One night only. The Houston Astrodome. It was a different world, a different universe, over 500 miles away. It was impossible. It was reckless. It was everything the doctors had warned against. A crowded stadium, the long and stressful journey, the sheer physical toll it would take on Leo's fragile body. Every sensible part of her mind screamed no. But then she looked at her son, asleep in his bed, looking smaller and more fragile than ever, and she knew she had to try. Logic had no place in this. This was a mission of love. It was a leap of faith into the unknown, fueled by the desperate hope that the voice on the radio held a magic that could defy even the starkest medical reality. The problem was money. There was none. Every last penny had gone to medical bills, to treatments that hadn't worked, to the crushing day-to-day cost of managing a severe illness. Sarah looked around her small, sparse home. There was nothing left to sell. Nothing except the one thing she had sworn she would never part with. In a small wooden box on her dresser was her mother's wedding ring. It was a simple gold band, thin and worn, with a tiny diamond chip that was barely visible. It wasn't worth much in terms of money, but its sentimental value was immeasurable. It was her last connection to her own mother, a woman she had lost too soon. She remembered her mother's words when she had given it to her. "This isn't about money, Sarah. It's about love that lasts. Keep it to remember that love is stronger than anything." Sarah held the ring in her palm, its familiar weight a comfort and an agony. Parting with it felt like a betrayal. But then she looked at Leo's drawing of Elvis, a vibrant, crayon-scrawled masterpiece that he kept on his bedside table. She thought of his whispered wish. Her mother would have understood. Love was about sacrifice, and the love she had for her son was the strongest thing in her world. With a heavy heart, she took the ring to a pawn shop in the next town. The man behind the counter was gruff and unsentimental. He squinted at the ring through a small lens, mumbled a low number, and pushed a few crumpled bills across the counter. Sarah didn't haggle. She took the money, a small, sad-looking stack of bills, and walked out without looking back. It was enough for 2 tickets, gasoline, and maybe a cheap motel room if they needed it. The tickets she bought over the phone were in the nosebleed section, the cheapest available. They were just numbers on a piece of paper, but to Sarah they felt like a golden key, a passport to a world of possibility. The journey to Houston was an ordeal, a 500-mile pilgrimage of hope and fear. Sarah packed the car with a meticulous precision, born of desperation. Leo's medications were arranged in a cooler. Pillows and blankets were piled in the back seat to create a comfortable nest. She packed a small bag of his favorite snacks, his worn teddy bear, and the precious crayon drawing of Elvis, which Leo insisted on holding for the entire trip. Every mile was a battle against her own anxiety. She watched Leo in the rearview mirror, constantly checking his color, asking if he needed anything, her heart leaping at every cough, every sigh. Leo, for his part, was a silent, brave traveler. He looked out the window at the passing landscape, the world outside his room, seeming vast and new. He was quiet, conserving his limited energy, his small hand never letting go of the drawing. They stopped every hour, Sarah helping him stretch his legs, taking his temperature, her worry a constant, churning thing in the pit of her stomach. She saw the looks from other travelers at gas stations and diners, the mixture of pity and curiosity in their eyes as they looked at her pale, fragile son. She ignored them. Her focus narrowed to this single, all-important mission. Was she a fool? Was this a wild, selfish goose chase that was putting her son at greater risk? The doubts whispered in her mind, but she pushed them away. She had to believe. She had to have faith in the power of a dream. When the skyline of Houston finally appeared on the horizon, a cluster of glass and steel giants shimmering in the Texas heat, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. They had made it. They had crossed the distance. The impossible was becoming possible. But her relief was short-lived. The Astrodome was not just a building. It was a phenomenon. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, a colossal monument to entertainment. The area around it was a swirling chaos of cars, people, and noise. Finding a parking spot was a nightmare. Navigating the massive crowds was even worse. Sarah carried Leo, her arms aching, his small body feeling heavier with every step. She held him close, trying to shield him from the jostling, shouting throngs of people. The energy of the crowd was electric, a wild, joyful thing. But to Sarah it felt threatening, a force that could easily swallow her and her fragile son. This was a world of health and vitality, of people screaming and laughing and living life at full volume. She felt like an intruder, a ghost from the quiet, sad world of sickness that they had left behind. "We're so far away, Mama," he whispered, his voice full of a heartbreaking sadness. "He won't even see us." Sarah looked at her son's crestfallen face, and all the effort, all the sacrifice, all the miles felt like they were for nothing. She had brought him all this way only to show him how far away his dream truly was. In that moment, watching the hope drain from her son's eyes, something inside her snapped. She had not come this far to be this far away. She had not sold her mother's ring for a distant glimpse. Her desperation, which had been simmering just below the surface, now boiled over. She would not accept this. She would not fail her son. Not now, not this close. With a new fire in her eyes, she picked Leo up, his small body a familiar weight in her arms. She ignored their assigned seats, turned her back on the cheap section where they belonged, and began the long journey back down. She didn't have a plan. She only had a purpose. She was a mother on a mission, and she would not be stopped. She was going to get her son to the front, or she was going to get thrown out trying. Either way, she would not be a silent spectator in the back row of his life's final chapter. As Elvis stood motionless on the stage, the sudden silence of the Astrodome was a strange and unfamiliar thing. In his world, there was always noise. The roar of the crowd, the blast of the music, the constant chatter of his entourage. Silence was a luxury, and in this moment, it was a heavy, expectant void. His eyes were locked on the small drama unfolding in the fifth row. He saw the security guard, a man just doing his job, his face set in a mask of stern authority. He saw the woman, her body language a symphony of desperation and defiance. And he saw the boy, a small, still figure in her arms, wrapped in a blanket that seemed too warm for the Texas night. It was the blanket that first caught his heart. It reminded him of the handmade quilts his mother, Gladys, used to make. He could almost feel the rough, comforting texture, smell the faint scent of home, and the woman's face. It was a face he knew. Not personally, but he knew the look in her eyes. It was the same look his own mother had worn 1,000 times. It was the look of a protector, a warrior, a mother who would place her own body between her child and all the dangers of the world. A flood of memories, unbidden and powerful, washed over him, transporting him from the glittering stage in Houston back to a small shotgun shack in Tupelo, Mississippi. He was a boy again, small and skinny, with a wild shock of black hair. He remembered the gnawing ache of hunger in his belly, the shame of worn-out clothes, the feeling of being an outsider, and through it all he remembered the constant, unshakable presence of his mother. Gladys Presley was the sun in his small universe. She was a woman of fierce love and deep abiding faith. She worked tirelessly in cotton fields and factories, her hands raw and calloused, all to make sure her boy had food on the table and a roof over his head. She was the one who had scraped together the money to buy him his first guitar, seeing the music that lived inside him before he even knew it was there. She was his first and greatest fan, his confidant, his fortress. He remembered one time, when he was just a kid, some bullies had cornered him after school, making fun of his homemade haircut and his quiet, dreamy nature. He had come home with a torn shirt and a bruised spirit. Gladys had seen him, and a fire had ignited in her eyes. She had marched down to the schoolyard, found those boys, and given them a lecture so fierce and so full of righteous fury that they never bothered him again. That was the look he saw in Sarah's eyes now. The same mama bear fire, the same absolute refusal to let the world hurt her child. He felt a deep, primal connection to this stranger in the crowd, a bond forged in the shared experience of a mother's powerful love. The promoter, a man named Colonel Tom Parker, was no doubt having a fit backstage. The colonel was a master showman who believed in a simple rule: the show must always go on. No exceptions. An interruption like this was a cardinal sin, a break in the carefully crafted illusion. Elvis knew the colonel would be furious, calculating the cost of the dead air, the disruption to the tightly scheduled performance. But in that moment, the colonel and his rules, the show and its demands, they all faded into insignificance. All that mattered was the scene unfolding before him. All that mattered was that look in the mother's eyes. He felt his own mother's presence so strongly it was as if she were standing right there beside him on the stage, whispering in his ear, reminding him of where he came from, reminding him of what was truly important. "Never forget the folks in the cheap seats, Elvis," she used to tell him. "They're the ones who need the music most." This woman and her child were not in the cheap seats anymore. They were in the heart of the storm, and he was the only one who could calm the water. The decision to stop the show was not a decision at all. It was an instinct, a reflex of the heart. It was the boy from Tupelo, the son of Gladys Presley, acting long before the king of rock and roll had time to think. He raised his hand, the signal that brought the $1 million production to a screeching halt. And then he let his heart speak into the microphone, his voice cutting through the confusion with a simple, powerful command that changed the course of the night and the course of several lives. The connection Elvis felt to the mother was a deep and immediate recognition of a shared, powerful love. But the connection he felt to the boy was something else entirely. It was a quieter, sadder, and far more profound bond. It was a connection to a ghost he had lived with his entire life. As he watched Sarah carry her fragile son down the aisle, the boy's head resting limply on her shoulder, Elvis felt a familiar hollow ache in the center of his chest. It was a feeling of absence, of a part of him that was missing. He saw the boy, and in his mind's eye, he saw another child, one he had never met, but one he knew as well as he knew himself. He saw Jesse Garam Presley. 35 minutes. That was the only time they had shared on this earth. On that cold January morning in 1935, in that tiny two-room house his father had built, his identical twin brother had been born, silent and still. 35 minutes later, Elvis Aram Presley had entered the world, crying and alive. He had grown up with the story, a piece of family lore that was both a tragedy and a kind of miracle. His mother, Gladys, had told him that God had needed one of them back in heaven, and that Jesse's spirit would always be with him, watching over him. For a young, lonely boy growing up in poverty, this was a powerful idea. He was never truly alone. He had a guardian angel, a brother who was a part of him. He would talk to Jesse in the quiet of his room, sharing his dreams and his fears. When he started to sing, he felt like he was singing for both of them. His success, when it came with the force of a hurricane, was not just his own, it was theirs. But beneath the comfort of the story, there was always a deep, unspoken sorrow, a guilt that he, the survivor, carried. Why had he been the one to live, to breathe, to sing, while his brother had been denied even a single moment of life? He saw the fragility in Leo, the thinness of the veil between life and death, and it resonated with the core of his own personal tragedy. This boy was fighting a battle for every breath, a battle his brother had lost before it even began. In that moment, Leo became more than just a sick fan. He became a symbol. He was a chance for Elvis to do something for the brother he could never help. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring Jesse back, but he could reach out to this one small, struggling boy. He could offer him a moment of joy, a moment of recognition. He could use the incredible power and fame that life had given him, and him alone, to shine a light on this one child. The promoter backstage saw a disruption. The journalist saw a potential stunt. The crowd saw a mystery. But Elvis saw a sacred opportunity. He saw a chance to make a small repayment on an unpayable debt. It was an act of grace for Leo, but it was also an act of healing for himself. As Sarah and Leo finally reached the foot of the stage, Elvis looked at the boy and felt a surge of protective love, so fierce it almost took his breath away. This was not just a boy. This was Jesse. This was the part of him that was fragile and vulnerable. This was the part of him that needed to be sheltered from the harshness of the world. He knelt down, the king bowing to the prince, and in that moment, the ghosts of the past and the hopes for the future collided in a single, silent act of communion. The vast, cavernous space of the Houston Astrodome seemed to shrink, becoming as intimate as a church chapel. The 18,000 people in attendance were no longer a roaring crowd. They were a silent congregation, their collective gaze fixed on the quiet drama unfolding at the foot of the stage. Sarah stood there trembling, the immense weight of the moment pressing down on her. The man who knelt before her was a legend, an icon whose face was known in every corner of the world. But the look in his eyes held no trace of stardom. It was a look of pure, unadulterated kindness, of a deep and gentle empathy that seemed to see right into her soul. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She was no longer in a stadium, surrounded by thousands of strangers. She was simply a mother, face to face with a man who seemed to understand her heart's deepest prayer. Elvis extended a hand, not in a gesture of greeting, but in a simple, open invitation. His focus was entirely on the small boy in Sarah's arms. "Hey there," he said again, his voice a soft murmur that was somehow more powerful than the loudest rock and roll anthem. "It's good to see you, Leo." Leo, who had been hiding his face, slowly turned. He saw the kind eyes, the gentle smile. The fear that had been gripping him began to melt away, replaced by a sense of profound wonder. This was real. The man from the radio, the superhero from his drawing, was talking to him. He called him by his name. A small, shaky smile touched Leo's lips. It was the first real smile Sarah had seen on his face in weeks, and the sight of it was enough to shatter the last of her composure. Tears welled up in her eyes and began to stream down her cheeks. "He wanted to give you something," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. She nodded toward the crumpled piece of paper clutched in Leo's hand. Elvis's gaze softened even more. "Is that for me?" he asked Leo directly, speaking to him as if they were the only two people in the world. Leo nodded, his shyness returning. He held out the drawing, his small hand trembling slightly. The paper was creased and worn from being held so tightly for so long. It was a simple child's drawing, a wild mess of color and crooked lines. The figure had a huge black pompadour, a suit that was more of a white blob with yellow squiggles, and a guitar that was bent at an odd angle. It was clumsy, it was imperfect, and to Elvis, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He took the drawing with a care that was almost reverent, his large, famous hands gentle as they accepted the fragile gift. He didn't just glance at it, he studied it, his face serious, as if he were examining a masterpiece in a museum. Ben Carter watched this exchange from the stairs, his journalist's mind struggling to process the scene. He had been trained to look for the angle, the motivation, the story behind the story. But what he was witnessing defied analysis. It was too pure, too genuine. The way Elvis held that simple drawing, the way he looked at that sick child, it was not a performance, it was a moment of grace. Ben felt the hard, cynical shell he had built around himself over years of reporting begin to crack and fall away. This was not a story about fame or celebrity. It was a story about human connection in its most elemental form. Elvis looked up from the drawing, his eyes meeting Leo's. "You're a heck of an artist," he said with a completely straight face. "You even got the sparkle on the jumpsuit. Most people miss that." He then did something that solidified the moment in the memory of everyone watching. He carefully folded the drawing, not casually, but with the precision of someone handling a precious document. He then unzipped the front of his jumpsuit, reached inside, and placed the drawing in an inner pocket, directly over his heart. He zipped the jumpsuit back up and patted his chest gently. "I'm keeping this right here," he told Leo, "so it'll be with me for the whole show." For Leo, this was a moment of pure magic. The king, his hero, had not just accepted his gift, but had treasured it, placing it in a place of honor. A look of pure, unadulterated joy spread across the boy's face, a radiance that seemed to push back the shadows of his illness. Elvis then turned his attention to Sarah. He saw her tears, her exhaustion, her fierce, unwavering love. He stood up, and for a moment he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. In that one small touch, he communicated a world of understanding, of respect, of shared humanity. It was a gesture that said, "I see you. I see your struggle. You are not alone." He then turned back to face the silent arena, leaving the mother and child in the care of the now gentle security guards. He walked to the center of the stage, the weight of that small crayon drawing against his chest, and he knew what he had to do next. The show had been stopped. Now the real performance was about to begin. Elvis Presley stood at the center of the stage, a solitary figure in a universe of expectant silence. The energy in the Astrodome had shifted. The wild, celebratory frenzy of the concert had been replaced by a deep, communal reverence. 18,000 people were leaning forward in their seats, their hearts open, waiting to see what the king would do next. The band, his trusted musicians who had been with him through thick and thin, watched him, their instruments ready but their faces full of uncertainty. The set list was a carefully constructed machine, designed for maximum impact, each song flowing into the next to build energy and excitement. That machine was now broken. The script had been thrown away. Elvis looked over at his lead guitarist, who was ready to launch into the next high-octane number, Hound Dog or Jailhouse Rock. Elvis gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. He then turned and walked away from the center stage microphone, a move that sent another ripple of surprise through the crowd and his band. He walked toward the back of the stage, to the gleaming black grand piano. This was an unusual move. While Elvis could play the piano, he rarely did so in his live shows, preferring the raw energy of the guitar, the freedom to move and dance. The piano was for quieter, more introspective moments, moments that were usually reserved for the recording studio or the privacy of his own home. He sat down on the piano bench, the long fringed cape of his jumpsuit settling around him. He rested his hands on the keys for a moment, his head bowed. The spotlights softened and focused on him, casting the rest of the stage into shadow. It was a signal to everyone that what was coming was different. This was not about the show, this was about the soul. He leaned toward the small microphone attached to the piano. "Tonight," he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "This one's for Leo." He then began to play. The notes that filled the silent arena were not the driving chords of rock and roll. They were the simple, soulful chords of a gospel hymn. He had chosen Peace in the Valley, a song that was a cornerstone of his own life, a song his mother had sung to him as a boy, a song that spoke of a release from worldly pain and sorrow. It was a bold, unexpected choice. In the heart of a rock concert, in front of a crowd hungry for excitement, he was offering a prayer. As he began to sing, his voice was transformed. It was stripped of all its usual swagger and bravado. The famous sneer was gone, the raw, rebellious edge smoothed away. What remained was the pure, unvarnished soul of his voice, a sound so full of genuine feeling that it seemed to reach out and touch every single person in the room. "Oh well, I'm tired and so weary, but I must go alone till the Lord comes and calls me away." The lyrics, telling of a journey toward a place of ultimate peace, took on a profound and personal meaning. He was not just singing a song, he was telling a story. He was offering a lullaby of hope to a small, sick child. He was singing for his own lost brother. He was singing for his beloved mother. He was singing for every person in that audience who had ever felt tired or weary, who had ever longed for a place without sadness or pain. Down in the front row, Sarah cradled Leo in her arms, rocking him gently in time with the music. Leo, who had been so full of awe and excitement just moments before, was now perfectly still, his eyes closed, a look of serene contentment on his face. The music was washing over him, a gentle tide of sound that seemed to be soothing not just his spirit, but his very body. He looked as if he were dreaming the most beautiful dream. The performance was a revelation. The band watched, their instruments forgotten, their faces filled with awe. They had played countless shows with Elvis, but they had never seen this side of him so clearly. This was not Elvis the entertainer. This was Elvis the vessel, a conduit for something much older and more powerful than rock and roll. This was the sound of the small church in Tupelo, the sound of hope rising up against hardship, the sound that had been the very foundation of all his other music. Ben Carter, the journalist, felt a shiver run down his spine. He realized he was witnessing the very essence of this man, the secret ingredient that had made him a global phenomenon. It wasn't just the voice or the looks or the moves. It was this ability to connect, to tap into a deep well of shared human emotion, to be a king on a stage one moment and a humble, prayerful man the next. He was singing of a valley where the bear would be gentle and the wolf would be tame, and as his voice soared on the final chorus, it felt as if he had brought a piece of that peace, that gentleness, right into the heart of the Houston Astrodome. The final chord of Peace in the Valley resonated through the vast stillness of the Astrodome, a single, perfect note that seemed to hang in the air like a star. Elvis held the note, his fingers pressing the piano keys, letting the sound decay naturally, slowly, as if he were reluctant to let the moment end. When the last vibration faded into absolute silence, a quiet so deep it felt sacred, he lifted his hands from the keyboard. For a long moment, nothing happened. The 18,000 people who made up the audience were frozen in time, held captive by the emotional power of what they had just witnessed. The raucous energy of a rock concert had been replaced by the reverent hush of a cathedral. No one wanted to be the first to break the spell. They were no longer a crowd of individuals. They were a single entity, united in a shared experience of profound emotion. Then, from somewhere in the upper decks, a single person began to clap. It wasn't the explosive applause of a fan. It was a slow, rhythmic, deliberate sound. A sound of respect. A sound of gratitude. Another person joined in, and then another, and soon a wave of applause unlike any Elvis had ever heard before rolled through the stadium. It was not the screaming, hysterical adoration he was used to. It was a thunderous ovation of the heart. As the applause grew, so did the emotional release. All around the arena, people were openly weeping. Tough, burly men who had come for a loud good time found themselves with tears streaming down their faces, not even trying to hide it. Young women who had been screaming his name just an hour before were now sobbing quietly into their hands. Strangers turned to each other, not with words but with shared looks of understanding, their eyes glistening. In that moment, the barriers that people build around themselves in public spaces had completely dissolved. They were all connected, their individual sorrows and hopes merging into one collective feeling of catharsis. Ben Carter stood on the stairs, his professional detachment shattered into a million pieces. He saw a man in a leather jacket, someone who looked like he belonged to a motorcycle gang, with tears carving paths through the dust on his cheeks. He saw a well-dressed older couple holding each other, their bodies shaking with silent sob. He felt a tear of his own escape and trace a hot path down his face, and he made no move to wipe it away. He had come to document a spectacle, but he had found a sacrament. He knew, with the certainty of a man who has just seen the truth, that his life had been irrevocably changed by a gospel song sung in the middle of a rock and roll show. On the stage, Elvis slowly rose from the piano bench. He looked out at the weeping, applauding crowd, but his eyes searched for and found the one person who mattered most. He looked down at Sarah, who was holding Leo, and he saw that the boy had fallen asleep in her arms, a peaceful, untroubled slumber. A small, faint smile was on Leo's lips, as if he were dreaming of a place where bears were dares were gentle and wolves were tame. Elvis gave Sarah a slow, subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that this moment had been for them. Sarah, her own face a mask of tears and gratitude, nodded back. It was a conversation without words, a promise kept, a prayer answered. The two security guards who had earlier tried to remove her now approached with gentle, respectful expressions. One of them leaned down and whispered something in her ear. She nodded, and they carefully helped her to her feet, creating a small protective circle around her and her sleeping son as they guided them away from the crowd toward the quiet sanctuary of the backstage area. Elvis watched them go, a feeling of profound peace settling over him. He then turned back to his band, took a deep, cleansing breath, and picked up his guitar. He gave a quiet count-off, and the band launched into Suspicious Minds. The show roared back to life. He performed the rest of the concert with all his signature energy and charisma. He danced, he karate kicked, he sweated, he drove the crowd back into a frenzy. But everyone knew that something was different. A layer of pretense had been stripped away. They had seen the man behind the crown, and the king was now more beloved than ever. He was no longer just a legend, he was family. The last chord of the final encore, a blistering version of Can't Help Falling in Love, echoed through the Astrodome. The house lights came up with a harsh, unceremonious glare, officially ending the magic of the night. The crowd, emotionally spent but spiritually full, began the slow, shuffling process of returning to the real world. Their conversations were not the usual post-concert buzz of excitement. They were quiet, personal and reflective. They spoke in hushed tones about that one song, about the little boy, about the moment the king had shown them his heart. Backstage, the typical scene of chaotic celebration was replaced by an atmosphere of quiet respect. The usual crowd of hangers-on, executives and local dignitaries seemed to sense that this was not a night for backslapping and champagne. Elvis walked off the stage, sweat plastering his dark hair to his forehead, and handed his jewel-encrusted guitar to his trusted road manager. He walked past the waiting crowd of people, his focus singular. He had one more performance to give, and this one was the most important of all. He made his way to a small private dressing room, far from the noise and commotion. He knocked softly on the door before pushing it open. Inside, the room was an oasis of calm. Sarah was sitting in a plush armchair, watching her son. Leo was asleep on a long sofa, tucked under his own familiar blanket from home. He looked peaceful, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, even rhythm. A crayon drawing of Elvis was lying on his chest, a treasured icon. Elvis entered the room and the door clicked shut behind him, sealing them off from the rest of the world. The king of rock and roll was gone. In his place was simply a man, his face etched with fatigue and a deep, compassionate tenderness. "How's our little lion doing?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Sarah looked up, and the gratitude in her eyes was so profound it was almost painful to see. "He's sleeping," she whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. The doctor who was waiting for us came in and checked on him. He said his breathing is steadier than it has been in weeks. He called it restorative rest. She shook her head in wonder. "I don't know how to thank you. What you did tonight, it was a miracle." Elvis pulled a chair from the corner and sat down opposite her. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, creating an atmosphere of intimate conversation. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice earnest. "Leo gave me something tonight that I haven't felt in a long time. He reminded me of what's real." He then began to speak, not in the platitudes of a celebrity, but with the raw honesty of a man sharing his own pain. He told her about growing up poor in Tupelo, about the fierce, protective love of his mother, Gladys. He told her how his mother had been the rock of his life, and how he had felt lost in the world since her death years before. "I saw her in you tonight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That same fire, that same refusal to give up. A mother's love is the most powerful thing on this earth. Don't ever forget that." He didn't speak the name Jesse Garon, but he spoke of the profound loneliness of being an only child who was meant to be a twin. He spoke of the feeling of a missing piece, of a lifelong search for a connection that had been lost at birth. "When I saw Leo," he said, looking over at the sleeping boy, I felt a need to protect him, to give him the strength that was meant to be shared." Sarah listened, her heart aching for this man who had everything and yet carried such a deep and private sorrow. The gap between the global superstar and the struggling single mother vanished completely. In that quiet room, they were just two people connected by love, loss, and the fierce primal instinct to protect a child. A soft knock came at the door. One of his trusted aides came in and spoke quietly to Elvis. Elvis nodded. He turned back to Sarah. "My personal doctor is here in Houston," he said. "He is one of the best in the country. He has already spoken with the top pediatric specialists at the city's best hospital. They are waiting for Leo. A private car is ready to take you both whenever you're ready. Everything, and I mean everything, will be taken care of. You won't have to worry about a single bill. Your only job is to be his mom." Sarah began to protest, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of his generosity, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Please," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let me do this. It's not for you, or even for me. It's for him. Every kid deserves a fighting chance." He stood up to leave, knowing they needed their privacy. He walked over to the sofa and looked down at Leo one last time. He reached out and very gently touched the boy's hair. He then turned, gave Sarah a small, sad smile, and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Sarah sat in the silence, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. The events of the night felt like a dream, a wild, impossible fantasy. But the sleeping boy on the sofa was real. The promise of the best medical care was real. The kindness of the king was real. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of a hope so pure and so powerful. It felt like it could light up the entire world. Then Carter sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit press room of the Astrodome, a wasteland of discarded paper cups and overflowing ashtrays. The other reporters were loudly dictating their stories over the phone, using words like electrifying, sensational, and triumphant return. They were describing the concert he had just seen, but they were not telling the story. Ben stared at his own blank notepad. How could he possibly capture the truth of what had happened? The language of music journalism felt inadequate, cheap. He crumpled up another sheet of paper. His editor called, his voice impatient. "Carter, where's the copy? I need 500 words on the show." "Did he kill it?" Ben took a deep breath. "He killed it," Ben said, his own voice sounding distant and strange to his ears. "But that's not the story. Not even close." He hung up before his editor could argue. He knew this story deserved more than a quick, cynical concert review. This was a story that needed to be handled with care, with the same reverence that Elvis had shown to that small crayon drawing. He began to write, not on his notepad, but in his mind. He wouldn't start with the music, he would start with the silence. He would write about a mother's desperate love, a journey of 500 miles fueled by nothing but hope. He would write about a pale, sick boy with a crayon drawing clutched in his hand. He would write about a king who stopped the world to listen to a whisper. He would write about a gospel song that had transformed a stadium into a sanctuary. His article, when it was finally published a week later, was titled "The Night the King Knelt." It didn't appear in the entertainment section. It ran on the front page of the magazine's feature section. It was a sensation. The story was picked up by newspapers and television stations around the world. It transcended music news and became a global story about human kindness. It revealed a side of Elvis Presley that the world had never truly seen. The tender, compassionate heart behind the rock and roll rebellion. It cemented his legend, not just as an entertainer, but as a man of profound grace. For years to come, that night in Houston became a touchstone, a piece of modern folklore. And what of Leo? Elvis's promise was kept. The best doctors in the country worked on his case. He underwent new, experimental treatments that Sarah could never have afforded. It was a long, hard fight, with many setbacks and moments of despair. But the boy had the spirit of a lion, and now he had a fighting chance. Miraculously, slowly, he began to get better. His tears began to recede. The color returned to his cheeks. His strength grew. A year after the concert, he was able to leave the hospital. 2 years later, he was in remission. He grew up to be a healthy young man. He never lost his love for Elvis's music, and he always kept a faded, creased crayon drawing in a frame on his wall, a reminder of the night a superhero had sung a prayer just for him. Elvis and Sarah kept in touch over the years, not as a celebrity and a fan, but as two friends bound by a shared, extraordinary experience. He never spoke publicly about what he had done for Leo. It was a private act of kindness, not for publicity, but from the heart. That night in Houston was a single, unplanned moment in a career filled with thousands of performances. But it was perhaps the most important moment of all. It was a night that proved that the greatest power a person can possess is not the ability to command the attention of the world, but the willingness to stop and listen to the quietest voice in the crowd. It was a night that showed that true royalty isn't about a crown or a castle, but about the compassion a king shows to the smallest and most fragile of his subjects. Well, that's the story of how Elvis Presley stopped the world for a moment and created a memory that would last forever. I hope this story of incredible kindness touched your heart. Where are you listening from today? Go ahead and drop your city or country in the comments below. I am always amazed to see how far these stories travel and connect us all. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to keep finding and sharing tales that uplift and inspire. And if you're in the mood for another story that will restore your faith in humanity, just click on the video that's appearing on your screen now. I promise you won't be disappointed. Until next time, remember that the biggest stages and the brightest spotlights are no match for the simple, quiet power of a compassionate heart. Thanks for listening.